Fantastic. So now we are on to the next hour, hour number 16. In the last hour, you heard from our speakers on HIV cure research, broadly neutralizing antibodies, why sex and gender matter for cure research, and also, addressing stigma, mental health, and why communities are so important in driving transformative change from India. So in this hour, I'll bring up our first speaker, who is someone whose work I'm super always inspired by, always impressed by, Professor Adam Bourne, who should be joining us soon. Hi, Adam.
Hey,
how are you doing?
I'm really good. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, it's so good to see you too. Dr. Bourne is Professor of Public Health and Director of the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University. And many of the students there I also look up to, based on the exciting social scientific work that they do. Adam's going to talk to us about Chemsex, HIV, and harm reduction towards an integrated response. And so that I think we're on track for time right now. So over to you, Adam.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rayner. It's really lovely to be here and to be part of this truly remarkable and incredibly important initiative. I was asked to speak to provide an overview of research relating to chemsex, how it relates to HIV, and how we can be considering responses and research on this topic into the future. As Rayner says, I'm based at a research centre called Archers, the Centre for Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University in Melbourne. Excuse me that the formatting has gone slightly awry as it converts into this online platform, but hopefully you can still make out most of what I'll speak to. I'll talk to 5 key points in my 20 minutes. I'll talk about what do we mean by chemsex. There's varying understandings and definitions of it. The context, I'll talk about the context in which it occurs. I'll talk a bit about what we know in terms of prevalence and patterns of chemsex, where it clusters, the consequences and harms that can be associated with it, how we might think about ways of identifying when chemsex is becoming a problem. It's not always a problem, sometimes it is. How might we identify that? And then talk through what some chemsex harm reduction approaches can look like. So let's start at the beginning. What do we mean by this in the first place? What is chemsex and what isn't it? So fundamentally, it's about the use of drugs in a sexual context. But the use of drugs during sex is not a new phenomenon. People have been using drugs, alcohol, and a range of other drugs during sex, well, for as long as drugs have existed, really. It's, there's documented instances of this going back many, many, many decades. What's changed, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, is the nature of the drugs themselves, the intensity of the effect that those drugs have, the longevity of that effect, and quite crucially, how some of those drugs can have quite an arousing impact. So they can make individuals feel quite sexually aroused. And it is that formation of issues that helps us understand this as a new phenomenon. What's really important to understand when it comes to chemsex is the intention of the act. So, for instance, a person could go out on a Friday or Saturday night to a gay club, take some drugs, they take some cocaine, they go home with a person, and they have sex with that person, and they happen to still be under the influence of drugs. That is somewhat coincidental in nature. What we're talking about in chemsex is I am intending to use the drugs to facilitate, enhance, or prolong the sex with another person. That's what you really need to try to hold in mind here. And that's why we make a distinction in the literature between what can be thought of as sexualized drug use broadly. So it's an umbrella term that relates to the use of drugs during sex. That can be coincidental and intentional in nature. And then chemsex specifically, which is about that intention to shape the intensity, longevity, or diversity of sex. Hopefully that makes sense. There's a range of drugs that we can consider part of the chemsex environment. The 3 that are most commonly reported chemsex drugs, those drugs that are facilitating that sense of sexual arousal, crucially is crystal methamphetamine. And in every country of the world, crystal methamphetamine always features to some extent. In some countries, it's a slightly smaller drug within the scene. But in every single country where there's been research happening, crystal meth is a part of the chemsex environment. In some countries, particularly in North America, in parts of Eastern and Central Europe, here in Australia, there's also a high use of GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate, within a chemsex environment, and also to some extent, and more likely in Western Europe, drugs like methadone. There are other drugs that could be used within the chemsex environment, and it's very, very location specific and depending a lot on drug markets and drug legislations in those specific countries. So things like ketamine, MDMA. And then there are drugs that are used alongside chemsex or part of the chemsex scene, but we wouldn't necessarily think of them as chemsex drugs. So things like alkyl nitrites or poppers or amyl, you know, they're all part of they're all the same thing really, just different street names. Those will be used to enable different forms of sex, but they're very, very short in intensity. We wouldn't describe them typically as a chemsex drug in and of themselves. Erectile dysfunction medication is often utilized again within this environment, particularly to offset the impacts of crystal methamphetamine, which can cause erectile dysfunction. Typically, chemsex is occurring in private homes. It's organized via hookup apps, Grindr, Hornet. Increasingly, we're seeing it on Sniffies. It can also occur within sex on premises venues, saunas, gay bathhouses, beats, and other environments within which, public environments within which gay men congregate. When we're talking about chemsex, that involves the injection of drugs, particularly the injection of crystal methamphetamine. That can sometimes, but not always, be referred to as slamming. So you might hear that term utilized, that specifically the use, and that's significantly the administration of drugs via injection. It is mostly, I would say, among gay men, and the vast majority of literature and studies have focused on gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. I'm very often asked whether or not it exists within other populations, to which my answer is almost certainly. It would be bizarre to imagine that chemsex isn't part of the sex lives of some heterosexual populations, trans populations, lesbian populations. To date, there's extremely limited research on those topics, but where that research has happened, and there have been 2 studies in the UK that are up on the screen right now, we see that it is very, very, very rare. So in fact, 0.2% of HIV negative heterosexual women within a HIV clinic. For instance, no one in a further online survey, no women who have sex with women were using crystal methamphetamine. So, you know, it's yes, we have to acknowledge it probably exists. It's probably not very commonplace. In terms of patterns among gay men now, so gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, there's a lot of complexity in how we understand the prevalence of use, particularly because there's some very, very wide diversity in how it is that we're measuring it. Going back to my earlier definition, are we talking about sexualized drug use in general? So people who are under the influence of drugs when they have sex, or are we measuring chemsex specifically, so that intention to prolong, enhance, or facilitate sex? What's the case definition? So are we talking about the last 4 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, over a lifetime? Lots of variation in that measurement period. And where is the appropriate setting for collecting the data? A lot of our data thus far has been drawn from HIV and sexual health clinics. That's a very, very skewed sample that we need to acknowledge, and it is important that we're expanding outwards. And we tend to see very, very different outcomes depending on the setting of data collection. There's an interesting observation how we word questions relating to chemsex. So for instance, the Melbourne Sexual Health Clinic did an analysis where they asked, in the same survey, they asked a question relating to drug use and sex in 2 different ways. Firstly, in the past 6 months, how often have you used party drugs for the purpose of sex? 16.9% said that they had. Secondly, they asked in the past 6 months, which of the following substances have you used during sex? And a long list of potential response options. 54% indicated that they had. So a really, really wide variation pending just a relatively minor change in how we're framing the question. So this is complicating the picture, and we need to all understand that. If you take a brief whiz around the world, you'll see that it is constructed and asked about in lots of different ways, which is prompting very different prevalence estimates. In Australia, when asked about use of crystal meth, specifically in the use in the last 6 months, 14% said that they had. A study of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland in the British Isles, they were asked about one of those 4 chemsex drugs I told you about at the start. 8.2% said they'd done it in the last 12 months, 3% in the last 4 weeks. In Europe, they asked specifically only about 3 certain chemsex drugs, but only within the last 3 months. The United States asks about in the last 3 months, but this time they introduced ecstasy into the mix, which complicates comparison to other countries. And then a paper I spotted more recently from China asks about a much broader range of drugs in the last 6 months. So ketamine, meth, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, heroin, GHB, methadone. And they frame all of the use of all of these substances as chemsex, which is a little bit complicated, I think. But as I say, my point here is to just try to emphasize how complex the research environment is in this space and how much need there is for future research that harmonizes these approaches and that can present us with a much more compelling and coherent prevalence estimates. We do know, if we look across the literature, that it is clustered within specific populations. We're much more likely to see chemsex among men living with HIV. We're much more likely to see it in major gay urban centers, New York, London, Barcelona, but you can also add to that list Nairobi increasingly, Bangkok especially, Kuala Lumpur as well. We know that it can be associated with men selling sex, engaging in transactional sex in exchange for drugs. We do see it across the life course. So there is a lot of variation by age. We do see it's a little bit more common among older men, but they may well be having sex in exchange for drugs with younger men as well. We see it's associated with a high number of sexual partners. It keeps you sexually aroused for quite a long period of time. That enables a longevity of sexual encounter and a high turnover of sexual partners. And there can be an association with what have sometimes been called esoteric sexual activities, I guess, really activities, and particularly seeing a higher instance of fisting among those engaging in chemsex. If I'm to give you the very best prevalence estimate I could, based on an extremely complex and diverse literature, my best guess is that it sits somewhere between 5 to 12% of men have sex with men who are regularly engaging in chemsex, but there's so much variation by country. And although injection of chemsex-related drugs is a concern, particularly in terms of harm reduction, which I'll come to in a moment, it is less common in most contexts. I'll say a little bit about the consequences and harms that can be associated with chemsex. There's been 2 really valuable reviews, a few valuable reviews looking at chemsex, HIV, and other STIs conducted over the last few years. The first was a study that focused primarily on countries in Europe and North America, by Maxwell et al. And they identified how engagement in chemsex was associated with a much higher likelihood of condomless anal intercourse, that you were living with HIV, as I just mentioned, and a much higher likelihood of having received a recent STI diagnosis. Laura Nevendorf, who was one of my PhD students, now based in Indonesia, did a separate systematic review and meta-analysis of sexualized drug use, so taking a slightly broader framing, particularly focused on Eastern and Southern Asia. And she found similarly a higher likelihood of condomless anal intercourse, HIV positive diagnosis, and a recent STI diagnosis. The thing I really want to emphasize at this point is the complexity in drawing inferences around the role of chemsex in HIV transmission. We simply don't have enough data to draw any firm conclusions here. There is almost no longitudinal data collection that has robustly and routinely captured data relating to chemsex that allows us to understand the role it could play in seroconversion. Again, another reason why we need to maintain our research efforts in this space. I think if we're in contexts where there's high PrEP use and low community viral load, someone like Australia, HIV transmission probably isn't actually that likely. Possibly lots of SDI transmission that's occurring, given the high partner turnover, but it's probably unlikely that it's playing much of a role in ongoing HIV incidence. In context of high viral load and low PrEP use, which is true of so many countries in South and Eastern Asia, particularly in some of the Pacific Islands, in sub-Saharan Africa, where viral load is high among MSM, PrEP use is still in its infancy, there is extraordinary potential for HIV transmission, and we need to be on the ground capturing information about that prevalence and patterns and transmission dynamics in order to help respond to it. In terms of, there has been some work looking at Chemsex and ART adherence in the last couple of years, and two separate studies drawn, one from just in the UK and the other drawn from a few different European countries, indicate that there is an association between those HIV positive men engaging in Chemsex and a slightly higher likelihood of missing ART drugs or suboptimal clinical attendance. I think before we all get too animated or worried about that, the authors were clear to say that while there was an association, there was a likelihood of slightly poorer adherence, there was no association with viral load detectability. So it wasn't necessarily having an impact on clinical outcomes. But again, something to watch in contexts where engagement and provision of clinical care is much more unstable. There's lots of concerns relating to Chemsex and mental health outside of HIV. And it's a bit of a complicated picture. Some research tells us that there's a strong association between the two. Other research actually doesn't show that or shows quite the opposite. So I think we need to be a bit careful about how we make assumptions here. There are a range of other harms that we need to be really mindful of. A lot of our attention is focused on HIV, but actually one of the most significant concerns for the health and well-being of gay, bisexual, and other heterosexual men is in terms of overdose. A lot of the effects of these drugs can be unpredictable. Their potency can vary. GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate, a drug you take in very small, very carefully timed doses. Very, very easy to overdose. It's something that we need to be very mindful of into the future. And again, routinely researching and tracking how that's impacting the lives of gay, bisexual, and other heterosexual men. But also a range of other legal, social, financial, and relational risks for us to be mindful of. I think we can think of Chemsex as on a spectrum. It's not necessarily all bad. There's many reasons why people engage in Chemsex, which I've talked to at length in many other presentations I've done on this topic. We have to hold in mind that it can facilitate pleasurable, enjoyable, safe, affirming sex between men. If we fail to remember that or hold that in mind, we're going to struggle to engage with people around how to manage their use effectively. I think if we think about it in terms of a spectrum, there are people who are using drugs to complement sex. It's periodic or it's irregular. Maybe it's just with a primary partner to add some fun to the sex that they're having. And I think we can think of that across a spectrum all the way through to people who might well be in crisis, people who are experiencing crystal meth psychosis or paranoia, people who are experiencing GHB overdose. They're isolated from social support. They're not able to access support through professionalized alcohol or drug use services or sexual health services because they're just not set up to deal with or to understand this issue. So that's something for us to be very mindful of. And in terms of chemsex harm reduction, there was a great paper that I worked on with Carol Strong and colleagues from Taiwan that was published in HIV Lancet a few years ago, which looks at scheme strategies for chemsex harm reduction. And it breaks it down into these three different components. Harm reduction techniques you can engage in before chemsex, those you can do during the chemsex session, and those you can engage in after the chemsex session. This has been quite widely adopted in a whole range of clinical environments, and I'd certainly encourage people to have a look at that paper and make use of it within their clinical practice if you're from a clinical background. And there are a range of other initiatives. There are a whole range of ways in which chemsex harm reduction has been enabled. I think the thing I often try to hold in mind when I'm helping design chemsex interventions is that it's occurring within quite dense social networks. And that means there is actually the opportunity to engage in peer-based approaches to train individuals around safe use of drugs, to promote the availability of PrEP if indeed it exists within that country context, to have conversations about viral load, to make provision for safe injection equipment if slamming is occurring. So I think there's a huge potential for peer-based programs in particular, and those can be further amplified via digital interventions, community mobilization, and the like. It's really important as an overarching principle. They're trauma-informed, they're sex-positive, they're designed with community, and that they maintain this intersectional lens through all the work as well. And Rayner, I think I'll probably leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. That was amazing. Thanks so much for really articulating what is such a complex phenomenon, and also context, right, in which many MSM and the people in the general population also kind of have to navigate. We're actually short on time, and actually we might not be able to take any questions. And I think also because it's pretty late in the US as well, so I'm not seeing any questions like come up. But it was really great seeing you, and we should definitely catch up in real life at some point.
Love that. I would love that. It was really good to see you, and thanks for having me on here.
Thanks so much, Adam, for your presentation. It was really fantastic.
No worries.
All right, so now we will, I think what I see here is there might be a ticker that comes up that tells us a little bit more about how we can take some action. So you can take some action to support HIV/AIDS research. If anything today you hear has inspired you to take action, it's something that it's a cause that you really feel for and want to advocate for, you can go to www.saveaidsresearch.org/act, and there are some there's guidance there on how you can do that. Once again, thank you so much, Adam, for a wonderful presentation. And now it is my privilege to bring on our next speaker, who is Professor Kenneth Ngure, who from the School of Public Health at Jomo Kenyatta University in Kenya, and President-elect of the International AIDS Society. It's really great to see you, Kenneth. And in the interest of time, I'll hand the time over to you right now to start your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Rayner, and greetings, everyone. I would start by thanking the organizers for organizing such a Herculean task. For the last almost 16 hours, it's been running like clockwork. So thank you for all the organizers, for this incredible achievement so far. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes to talk about Africa-led biomedical HIV prevention and mentoring the next generation of African researchers. So I'll start by mentioning what many of us know is that HIV remains a critical public health issue in sub-Saharan Africa, with women being disproportionately affected by HIV. As you can see from literature, we have about 62% of all new infections in women versus 44% globally. And for decades, HIV prevention research in Africa was often led by institutions in global north. But in the recent, there's a focus towards African-led HIV research, both in the design, implementation, and in policy translation. And here in my presentation today, I'll focus mainly on biomedical trials. This is on oral PrEP, the ring and injectable, the vaccines, and then how we've been able to translate this into the real world. So in the beginning, we started with oral PrEP. I think that's where many of us started the biomedical prevention. And then we went to the equivalent ring, and that's what I'll highlight. And in around 2007, 2008, with a team of other researchers, we had a question or a hypothesis where we were trying to ask ourselves, can a pill prevent HIV? And there are several studies that were done in the world, but specifically I want to highlight two studies that were done in Africa. One of them was a study that I was involved with, which is a partners PrEP study, which had a population of HIV serodiscordant couples done in Kenya and Uganda in trial sites that were led by African scientists that was able to show that PrEP, there's a typo there, with about 81% adherence, had a 75% efficacy. And this is a Truvada or emitricitabine and tenofovir. And then there's a study on TDF among the heterosexuals done in Botswana with a 79% efficacy, which was able to show 62% efficacy. These were among the initial trials that led to policy change in terms of using oral PrEP as a HIV prevention tool. Another study, or two studies that I want to highlight here, is the ASPIRE and the RING studies that were done exclusively in Africa, that were able to demonstrate that the ring is safe and efficacious. And though the efficacy shown there was much less, it was about 27 and 31% respectively, what we learned from this study is that efficacy increased with use. And there was also a differential protection by age, with women over the age of 25 having a much higher protection, but this was all linked to adherence. So this again is a tool that has been now shown to be used in Africa and is being scaled up in Africa, especially for women, and could also be scaled up in other regions of the world from research done exclusively here. And then it doesn't only end up in discovery science. We have been able to see that after discovery, African scientists are not stopping there. They are also moving forward to working on delivery. And I will highlight a few studies in this dimension. One of them is a study that we are involved in, and this was trying to show that you can simplify delivery by having HIV self-test used at home to reduce the number of visits that people come to the facilities. And what we're able to see, that changing from the standard of care, which is the 3-monthly visit, to 6-monthly visits with the HIV self-test kits did not compromise adherence or retention. Similarly, we are also using pharmacies, both brick and mortar pharmacies. These are pharmacies that are fixed, and e-pharmacies in Africa to try and simplify delivery and reach people who do not visit the fixed facilities. This has also been shown to work quite well. These are studies done in Kenya, and they will be replicated in other areas of the world. Again, led by African scientists in collaboration with scientists from the Global North. We also learned from this study known as REACH MTN 034 that when you provide choice, you can lead to higher adherence and continuation, and that young women are able to make a choice. We also learned on various ways to support adherence and using a menu of adherence options. And again, this is an important study that was done in Uganda and Zimbabwe and South Africa that is also showing how to support young women to adhere to HIV prevention technologies. We've also learned that delivering choice increases uptake, and as Professor Kamia and colleagues said, offering choice to HIV biomedical prevention options, including cabotegravir, in a flexible model can increase coverage and reduce HIV infections. And in this model, they also included PEP. So what are we learning about injectables for HIV prevention? Again, in these studies that are being done in sub-Saharan Africa, some of them, including HPTN 084, was able to show that that cabotegravir injectable reduced the risk of HIV acquisition by 88% compared to TDF FTC group. And this was done in 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Then similarly, when you think about the lenacapavir or PURPOSE trials, there is a series of PURPOSE trials, including from PURPOSE 1 to 5, and PURPOSE 1 and 2 have been done in Africa. And specifically, I want to highlight PURPOSE 1, and this is using lenacapavir injectable, the 6-monthly injection. And this was tested in South Africa and Uganda. And this was a landmark trial that demonstrated 0 infections in the lenacapavir arm compared to the standard PrEP arm. And having been in HIV prevention for many years, this was clearly a landmark finding. And now from that study, there are discussions on how to then implement this. And hopefully this will also be a potential game changer in HIV prevention. For vaccines have not been left behind, and there are many studies that are being conducted in Africa, but specifically, one of them is PEPFAR, that is Africa-led with European support, and tested to experimental HIV vaccine regimen compared to oral PrEP. And though the vaccine showed no efficacy, it improved African trial capacity and infrastructure. And we've learned a lot from the vaccine trials, and there are many other vaccine trials that are either in progress or being planned. So I would urge everyone to stay tuned on that. So then when you come to upcoming trials, there are many upcoming trials. Some of them are on multi-purpose technologies, others are on injectables, others are on other products used around sex. But what I want to highlight is on this study known as Expressive, which is trying to test the efficacy and safety of a monthly PrEP pill. It's known as MK8527, no name yet. But most important thing is that this is an additional prevention tool that will get into the prevention toolbox that has potential to be demedicalized, sort of dispensed in pharmacies or in other ways that can reach people more easily than injectables, and will offer choice to people, especially those who struggle with the daily adherence. And it's being conducted in over 30 clinical trial sites in Africa. And there's both Expressive 10 and 11. For 10, it's for women, cisgender women, and 11 on cisgender men. Again, stay tuned for this because, again, a potential game changer when it comes to HIV prevention. So now we are going to shift gears and talk about mentoring the next generation of African researchers. So it's worth noting that Africa has very limited research capacity in all fields of science. As you can see from the bar chart on my left, is that compared to other countries, Africa has very few scientists per million of inhabitants. And again, and Africa is not a homogeneous zone. There are also differences by country. So there is actually a need to build this capacity. And this capacity can be built through mentorship. And as we think about HIV prevention, currently there's a lot of work happening in HIV prevention. But for it to be sustainable, we need to build local capacity and mentorship to ensure that young African scientists take roles in clinical trials in all phases, from phase 1 to phase 4, or even preclinical trials. And then we also need young scientists participating in epidemiological studies, data science and modeling, and even translating these findings into the real world through implementation science. There are several key approaches to mentorship. Some of the approaches include structured mentorship programs through African Academies of Science. For example, African Academy, there's one academy known as African Academy of Science. There's STANTE, which I'll be discussing about. There are NIH formative programs, which have been very effective in training the next generation of scientists. And even many of the current scientists in Africa have been trained through the formative programs. Then we also need to think about South-to-South collaboration, where African scientists mentor peers across the continent. Again, this is one of the approaches that is gaining a lot of leverage, and people are looking at it a lot more. And then there are also career development pathways through research grants, lab exchanges, and conference participation. But more importantly, there's need for gender equity in mentorship, and especially encouraging young women scientists to have support and to grow in science. And I know this is not only an African problem, I know it's a global problem, but in Africa, I think this is something that also needs to be looked into. Then in Africa, many of the young scientists and early career scientists suffer challenges such as lack of visibility because there are limited opportunities, such as few conferences, few networking opportunities compared to the West. And that's one of the key challenges. Then there is challenges in terms of mentorship and career development, access to resources and funding, especially considering that we do not have a lot of local funding, that most of the funding comes from Global North, and there is a way that you need to write your application to fit within the Global North. So if you are as a young scientist based in the African setting, you may not be familiar with the requirements of the Global North. Then the issue of recruitment and retention is a real challenge and has even been aggravated by the recent US funding cuts, where the young scientists are seeing the more senior scientists struggling to ensure that their research teams are sustained or able to answer their research questions. So this, I think, has rocked the boat. And my fear is that we may find a lot of younger scientists dropping off from science, moving on to other fields. And then there are also challenges unique in the developing world, especially in terms of lack of in research infrastructure. When you think about some of our institutions, we always talk about scientists, but we forget the administrative piece, which is equally important. And that is a piece that has not been well developed in the African continent, especially in the African institutions. So again, that's a unique challenge. Here, I want to highlight one example of an African institution that is doing, or network that is doing the mentorship. And this is known as SANTEM, which is amplifying voices from the South experiences and lessons learned from Sub-Saharan African Network for HIV, for TB HIV research excellence. And the aim of this is to contribute to world-class scientific research that addresses African health research priorities through collaborative pioneering basic clinical and translational research. It also aims at increasing levels of globally competitive African scientists and research groups by supporting research skills and establishment of a critical mass of research sites, and has several additional aims. And I would encourage us to just look at SANTEM and see how well it's trying to do this. It's well funded to a tune of over $10 million by many funders, including the Gates Foundation. And it had done a great effort in collaborating with institutions from 7 countries, from South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, and one more country that's hiding down there, but 7 countries. So again, this is an African network that is mentoring young scientists in a great way. And then the other one, it's a Fogarty funded grant that our team recently got. It's known as STAWI. And this one is looking at training and building capacity of African institutions, especially my university, which is JKUAT, to train both on implementation science and social behavioral science from through postgraduate programs, that is both PhD and master's program. It's also looking at training the faculty members to teach better. It's looking at strengthening the curricula in those areas that I've mentioned, but also looking at offering short courses to bridge the gap in terms of mentorship, in terms of grant writing, in terms of research methods. And this has recently started, and we have several other Fogarties happening in Sub-Saharan Africa that are trying to train young scientists in these various areas. So as we think about a strategy to amplify voices, one of the key things is there are many frameworks, and one of the frameworks is the one I'm showing here, espoused by Kasprowitz and colleagues. And it's looking at training and mentorship through recruitment of motivated trainees, experienced, well-trained mentors, and then looking at conducive research ecosystems through coherent and institutional strategies relevant to local challenges. And it's also looking at local and international stakeholders to build long-term investments by governments and funders and building sustainable networks. So as I come towards the end, I want to reiterate and say that African science contributes not only to regional progress, but to global HIV prevention strategies. And innovations from African trials are now influencing global guidelines, even for research that is done exclusively in Africa. And that in Africa, we are also looking at testing HIV prevention tools among cisgender women and adolescents that are not being done in other places or other regions of the world. So as we think about this funding landscape that is shaky, we need to always advocate for African science, because there are unique studies that are happening here that are informing the global landscape. And that there is a lot of testing of various methods, from injectables, orals, vaccines, and behavioral interventions. And that what we are finding is that we are getting evidence that can be used in Africa and also in other places of the world, especially those that are resource constrained. So as I come to the end, I would want to encourage many people, but mainly encourage the African research participants, because without whom we would not have been able to test all these innovations that I have talked about, and then also the investigators and drug developers and funders. So thank you. I hope I've kept my time.
Thank you so much, Ngure. Amazing presentation. All the work that's being led, or innovations that are African led, and also the importance of mentorship, I think cannot be underscored further. I think one thing that I'm thinking about and reflecting off one of the comments. I think we've got time for one question right now, but someone has mentioned, we heard earlier today from many American trial networks, and I think part of decolonializing and also promoting equity in global health is that co-learning, right? The reciprocal learning from each other. Are there any chances for co-mentoring within your network so that we can promote these kinds of exchanges?
Yes, I want to say that research and mentorship is collaborative. Even as we talk about African Red, it's not African Red excluding other places. So we have a lot of co-mentorship. I personally participate in mentoring students that with colleagues from Global North. So it's happening. And most of these networks also have guest lecturers coming in to give talks, and our faculty also going out to give talks about African science or science conducted in Africa. So there's a lot of interactions and collaboration, both in mentorship and in research.
All right, thank you so much. Would really love to have more time to dive deeper into what's needed, but I think we need to move on to the next presentation. Thank you so much again, Professor Ngure, for your time today.
Most welcome.
All right, so now we're moving on to the final presentation for the hour by Professor Wilbroad Mutale from the University of Zambia School of Public Health, Professor Mutale will be telling us more about the impacts of PEPFAR's aid cut to Zambia. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm very privileged to present this with my mentee, my colleague, Leah, who is going to talk about most of the results. I'll give the background and then come to the conclusion as well. So basically, this study is emanating from the challenges that we have faced, all of us, after aid was reduced by the USAID and the American government. And so here the title is Perspectives, the Patient's Perspective on the Aid Cut. And this study is still ongoing, but what I'll share with you are what we are finding from our preliminary. So I'll focus on the patient's perspective, and in the future we'll share with health worker perspective. And so let's get started. So basically, as we all know, in January, the US government cut aid. The PEPFAR program went into oblivion. And this affected a lot of services in our situation and many other African countries. So essential services to the people living with HIV were affected. Access to ARVs were threatened. Psychological and peer support, some of the programs were cut and some of them totally stopped. And then we have got also access to other things like HIV counseling. All those services were affected as well. So we wanted to talk to the patients. Let's go to the next slide. To talk to the patients, and this was a study which was designed. It was assisted in the sense that we had we worked with groups of people living with HIV, and they were able to identify people and then share the links of the questionnaire. And so it was patient administered, but there was assistance if there was trouble. And this was for people living with HIV above 18 years of age. And we are talking about Zambia, one of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we talked to about 5,000 people. There are 10 provinces, and we got about 5,000 from each. And the total came to about 500 from each province to about 5,000 for the total. The next slide. And the overall aim for this study we haven't actually finished sharing. We are also talking to the Ministry of Health about this, and I want just to put that disclaimer, to systematically assess the effects of the 2025 PEPFAR funding withdrawal on the availability, accessibility, and continuity of HIV services in Zambia. On this particular slide, which I'll share with you today, we are going to assess the effects of funding withdrawal on access to services and immediate psychological impact from the patient's perspective. So it's not the health worker talking, the patient's voice. And this study will provide evidence on the impact that we have noted between January and at the end of July. Next slide. And so I'll allow my colleague Leah to just quickly take us through what we found, and then I'll come back quickly with the recommendation and conclusions. Over to you, Leah.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilbroad Mutale, for that introduction. I'll take you through the results that we found, and starting with the participant characteristics, we can see from the chart that we have for the gender and the age groups, that most of the respondents in our data were female, that's 66.7%, with the largest group being 35 to 44 years, that's making 25%. And coming to the characteristics in terms of facilities and at duration, we saw that most participants, 96.7%, reported being on ART for multiple years, and 47.3% accessed these services primarily through public health centers. And in more characteristics, we'll talk about the art duration in the years. For the most respondents that said that they had accessed art duration for years, the largest group, that's 34.9%, had been receiving treatment for 1 to 5 years. And now we go to the challenges that the participant had in terms of accessing HIV services. So we asked the participant a number of questions in terms of them experiencing difficulties in accessing HIV services, and also the difficulties that they experience in getting medication on time. And we saw that 57.2% of the respondents said that they had difficulties in accessing HIV services, and 48% had difficulties in getting medication on time. And by gender, we see that for the male people living with HIV, they face difficulties in accessing HIV services and also getting medication on time. And coming to the age groups, we noticed that the age group greater than or equal to 65 years experienced more difficulties in accessing HIV services as compared to the other age groups. Prevalence by province indicates that provinces like Rapula, Northwestern, Western, Lusaka, and Southern were the top 5 provinces that experienced difficulties when it comes to accessing HIV services, as we can see also from the map. And prevalence by district, in terms of the top 5 experiencing difficulties in accessing HIV services. On top of those, we had Chilenge, Solowezi, Mongo, Mbala, and Mwinilunga experiencing difficulties in accessing HIV services. Now, when we come to the age group, we noticed that similarly, we had age group greater than or equal to 65 experiencing more difficulties when getting medication on time. This is similar to the finding that we had for the when we grouped the age group to understand the challenges that they were experiencing at national level. And now when we come to the comparison by district in terms of getting medication on time, we found that Challenge is also at the top in terms of experiencing challenges in accessing medication on time. Now, we asked the participant to state their level of difficulties in accessing various HIV services after January 2025, which is after the PEPFAR cut, and the results of the responses were grouped by gender, age group, and province. And these results have been highlighted in this graph, and we see that in the groupings where we have the gender, the age group, as well as the provinces, we notice that age group greater than or equal to 65, as well as certain provinces like Western Province, experienced more difficulties in accessing HIV medication or at refill. So we followed up these findings with a binary logistic regression just to understand if there are any significant differences in terms of access to HIV medication at refill. And we noticed that the difference was not significant between the males and females, but we had differences in age group, that is age group greater than or equal to 65, having 2 times the odds of reporting difficult HIV medication at refill as compared to age group 18 to 24 when holding other variables constant. And when we come to the provinces, Western Province had 9 times the odds of reporting difficult HIV medication refill compared to Central Province. Now we come to multi-month prescriptions. We also asked the participant to state the level of difficulties in receiving multi-month prescriptions. And we found that for the age group greater than or equal to 65 years, this age group experienced more difficulties, and provinces like Western, Northwestern, Wakula, and Eastern provinces also had difficulties, as we can see from the chart. But also we followed these results by a binary logistic regression, and similarly, we noticed that there was no meaningful difference in the odds of the males and females. But when we look at the age groups, again, group greater than or equal to 65 had twice the odds of reporting difficult multi-month prescriptions as compared to age group 18 to 24. And then provinces like Western, Northwestern have 5 times the odds of reporting difficult multi-month prescriptions as compared to Central Province, of course, holding other variables constant. And then we also asked them to state the levels of difficulties in accessing lab tests. And similarly, there was no significant difference between the gender, but for age group greater than or equal to 65 and provinces like Western, Wapula, Northwestern, and Eastern provinces, these experienced more difficulties. And we followed up these results by a binary logistic regression, which showed that, of course, no differences between the males and females, but we do have significant differences in the age group greater than or equal to 65 that also had twice the odds of reporting difficult HIV lab tests compared to the group 18 to 24 years. And Western Province has 6 times the odds of reporting difficult HIV lab tests compared to Central Province. And then we asked about the level of difficulties in counseling or peer support. And we can see from the hierarchy chart here that it seems like, for the males, it's a bit significant, but then we wanted to follow this, of course, with the binary regression so that we can prove our results. And then also age group greater than or equal to 65 looks like it's also having a lot of difficulties in certain provinces. So now the results of the binary regression showed that there was no meaningful differences between the males and the females, but for the age group greater than or equal to 65, they had twice the odds of reporting difficult counseling or peer support when you compare them to age group 18 to 24. And then Wapula Province has 14 times the odds of reporting difficult counseling or peer support compared to Central Province. And now we asked the participant to state the impacts of the PEPFAR cut on their psychosocial well-being. And so majority of the participants expressed fear and anxiety that was related to loss of access to care. They were feeling more anxious, they were feeling unsupported. And here we follow it up with the chart. And just to highlight also that we have a very interesting group here that is showing anxiety, they missed medication doses, they were afraid of losing access to care, they were feeling unsupported, and that's 7.6% of them. So this group, they really had a lot of challenges and their psychosocial well-being was quite affected. But of course, on top of that is the group that said, I'm afraid of losing access to care, that's 27.6%. And also we analyzed the impact of the cut on access to clinics, and we saw that most of our participants, 10.9%, expressed that they had changed clinics due to the PEPFAR cut, and 11% stopped going for some HIV services because of that. And we followed our findings by doing some regression analysis using machine learning just to understand in general what are the factors associated with difficulties in accessing HIV services. And so we conducted this regression analysis just to understand those different factors. And we can see from the heat map, just doing some correlation analysis to see how the variables are correlated. And we saw that all correlations were below 0.5. So we fitted these features in our model. We used a random forest and logistic regression model. For the random forest, we found that it had an AUC of 0.94, which is quite good. And then for the logistic regression, it had an AUC of 0.84. So the random forest was used to rank our models, and logistic regression helped in getting the odds ratios. And we also had other metrics like precision recall and F1 scores that were used to test the performance. Now, the top features that we found using the random forest on top of the list was the trouble getting medication. We had district, age group, trust in health facility, type of facility being used, duration on earth, and gender in that order, being the most features that were associated with challenges in accessing HIV services. And now we look at the results of the logistic regression. We found that there was no significance, of course, in the gender. But when we talk about age group greater than or equal to 65, like in previous findings, giving a p-value less than 0.03, this was 2 times more likely to experience challenges in accessing HIV services in general. than age group 18 to 24. And on top of the list for the province was Wapula province, that was 12 times more likely to experience difficulties in accessing HIV services than Central province. And then participants who recorded trouble getting medication on time were 86 times more likely to experience difficulties in accessing HIV services. Now hand over to you, Prof. Maybe to just share the summary of findings and our conclusions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Leah, for that nice presentation. So, team, just want to summarize here what we have. So, first of all, to say that HIV funding cut has widespread impact across gender, age groups, and various regions in Zambia. So, I think this is the first step that we have done, and in discussing with the Ministry of Health, hopefully we would also get the health worker perspectives on the impact that what we've seen from the patient's perspective. And also we see that not everyone is affected the same way, so the older ones seem to be affected more by this aid cut, and that's something that we need to be looking at. I'll mention when I come to the recommendations. Then you could see there are some provincial differences, and this information is important for national representation for us, but also for the people who belong to Sub-Saharan Africa to think about the differential impact. It's not the same. So if you've got different areas, you want to assess where the issue is, that's what would apply, rather than thinking at national level, look at the sub-districts and see what's going on in terms of impact. And nearly 1 in 5 respondents, nearly 1 in 5 respondents express fear of losing access to HIV care due to the funding cuts. So this is not actually losing, just a fear. And so there's some psychological impact that we would like to explore further as well. Okay, the next one. All right. So basically some few recommendations for government, and we are discussing with the Ministry of Health in Zambia. We are just presenting this for the first time, and so we have shared with them, and we are looking for the platform to share as well. So you are the first to see these results, so we are very happy to share this. So government and stakeholders should consider differential impact of HIV cut when developing mitigation measures. So not everything that needs to be done the same way. There are provinces that are differentially affected and individuals. So looking at those and tailoring our mitigation. Then rural districts are supposed to be prioritized, as we have seen in our results. And also think about psychological impact. I think mostly people are thinking about drugs, lab tests, but what is the impact? I think this should be one of the few studies going to the patients, not listening to our health workers only. And finally, mitigation measures should be put in place for people who have stopped accessing services. So the danger is that some people might give up and just stop taking the medication. And we need to explore this further, and we need to prevent people from stopping going. We have got about 10% stopping services. We didn't categorize what services, but just that they can stop. It could be medication, it could be counseling. So we can look further into that. But the point is that we need to make sure that that number does not increase. Otherwise, we risk resistance and also just collapsing the whole healthcare system for HIV, which we have worked for many years. I'll stop there, and just to the next slide, just to thank our teams that have been the Ministry of Health that gave us permission to work with them, the University of Zambia where I work, and also the team at Cyclo, the research center that we are supporting, the teledoctor team that helps us as well, and all the funders for this work that we are doing. So thank you very much, and we'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Mutale, and also thank you, Leah, as well for the presentation. I am just really so apologetic because we are just running a little bit behind time for the entire program. But I encourage anyone to reach out to Professor Mutale and team, if they want to find out more about the ongoing work and the kind of research and the community work that is done to mitigate what the impact of the funding cuts are. Thank you so much for bringing to light these issues to us, Professor Mutale. And now I guess we will be moving on to the next hour.
Thank you so much.